Hello, everyone, and a good day to all of you. I wanted to talk and give a kind of really go into the weeds and talk about the differences here between the 416 parts, as I recently finished this G95K inspired or clone build as I have up here, and compare it to AR-15 parts and just really talk about what parts are compatible, mostly because it'll help if you're doing like a 416 clone build, especially if you're using an AR-15 lower, as I did here, but just in general, because there's a lot of parts, of course, that are purely proprietary on the 416 platform, MR556 and all of that, but there's also a lot that you would think are compatible that actually require a little bit of modification on an AR-15 or just flat out do not work. So I'm going to talk about this is we'll just go from the rear, from the stock all the way just forward and talk through things here. So I've just separated the lowers just so it's easier to see what's going on here and fit everything onto the frame. So the stocks are going to be a very easy part for me to talk about because they're compatible. Little caveat with that is at one point the HKs were going with a commercial tube. Right now they're a mil spec, but you do occasionally see some of the commercial tubes floating around, but I do think that those are the rarity. They're not the rule. Most of the parts, by the way, that I will be talking about today is just like more so the A5, which is the mostly newest version of the 416, and just how the parts compare there to an AR-15. But as far as the stocks, they're perfectly fine. Mil spec tube up here on this AR, and both of these can be interchanged, and I have done so in the past. One or a few differences with the actual 416 or HK buffer tubes, and I don't have an actual one on hand to compare, but I do have an MR762 lower to compare, which I'm going to bring up on occasion because a lot of the same features that are on the 416 parts are on here, and I can reference them this way. So, two differences. The first is the actual HK buffer tubes have rollers here. I haven't really noticed these to be all that effective. They do prevent the stock from wobbling excessively, but if you have a well-machined buffer tube, like this is actually an Aero Precision, but it's a very nice tight fit with this stock, and it doesn't wobble at all. So as long as you have a nice stock and a nice buffer tube, I wouldn't really worry about that. I don't think you need these rollers. I thought they were kind of a cool idea until I kind of had this buffer tube and been messing around with these. It's really not necessary. But the second feature that's on these HK buffer tubes is the OTB features. So that is two things. First, you have these 3 holes drilled in the rear of the buffer tube that you can see right there for drainage, and then you also have holes drilled into, or I should say 1 hole rather, drilled into the rear adjustment slot right there for the stock to go in. That way water can come out the bottom. If you use the whole suite of HK buffer tube plus their stock, these 3 holes in the rear actually do correspond with 3 holes drilled on the slimline stocks, which are pretty hard to see, but if I just zoom this in right here, you can see where the light's coming through there. So just matches up perfectly with that. But for compatibility with an AR-15, all good, all identical there. But moving forward now to a part where there actually is a difference, that is the castle nut. So you can see here, this is one of the A5 extended castle nuts compared to your regular mil-spec, just regular length castle nuts up here on this AR. So I've already made actually a pretty long full-length video just talking about why you need specific buffer tubes and certain accommodations if you want to use these extended castle nuts on an AR-15 lower. There's 2 reasons, actually, to delve into it even a bit deeper. First off, so you need this little hump right here. See that one right there? This needs to be either further back or just machined off entirely in order for the extended castle nut to have room to clear when you're installing it. And as you can see on this Aero Precision one, this is one of the very, very few buffer tubes, and I think the Strike Industries one would be compatible as well, but this is one of the few that actually would fit. You can see that this whole section here is machined nice and cleanly, so you can fit an extended castle nut on there, which is quite nice. These do help to have some extra drop resistance when the stock is fully closed, but it's a very minor use case. I just think, you know, that if I can get them on there, to add a little bit extra rigidity, and it's not an annoyance, then I may as well. But in other cases, they are an annoyance. In the case of this one, this is just a regular mil-spec buffer tube, and you can absolutely not put a extended castle nut onto here. The second reason, actually, there is 2 why you can't use an extended castle nut, is the buffer retaining pin right here. So Your standard, of course, is just this kind of little pin right there. Compared to on the HKs, you have a very large piece of metal. It's been heavily reinforced, and you need to be able to screw this buffer tube in enough, of course, to hold that down on an AR-15. On actual HK416s, this buffer retaining pin is retained by another roll pin, actually, that's drilled right about here. On a side note, I did find a pretty good diagram if you want to drill this yourself. That's not the route I ever went. Here is an extra pin that I have here, just laying out. So the important part, first off, is even if you manage to, so let's say, for example, you're trying to use one of these, because these actually do help quite a bit, in my opinion, to have in an AR. But let's just say even if you're trying to use one in an AR like this, where you just have a standard castle nut, where you can screw the buffer tube in enough, you're still going to run into an issue, because this is going to sit way too high, and it's actually going to hit your carrier, and you're not going to be able to run the action. If you look here, what needs to be retained is, so on a normal 416 or on an MR556, normally the roll pin would go through right here, and it would push down the this retaining pin from here. On the case of an AR-15 standard mil-spec buffer tube, it's going to not do that, and it's going to sit way too high. So again, the only option to use these is with one of these enhanced buffer tubes, because not only do they have this extra spot machined out, but they also have these little ears that go around and actually push down on this. If you kind of think of this as like a dual-stepped part, right? So you have this most lowest part right here, and then you have the second little step here, and then the very top, which is what actually holds in the buffer. You need to, on an AR-15, you need to engage these side steps right here and push it down, just as is done right here. Moving forward to the end plate, that is completely normal, so no issues there, and HK doesn't really do anything special with it either, so there's literally nothing to talk about there. And I nearly forgot to talk about the buffer. There is a lot going on with the buffer. This is a part that you could switch between a AR-15 or vice versa. However, it is its own special weight here. So taking this out, so the buffer itself, you can see, is just resembles the same sort of profile as on a regular mil-spec buffer. However, the weight is between an H2 and an H3. And from what I've read from other people with their 416 and MR556 buffers, these are actually these kind of vary in weight, because these are filled with tungsten powder, which if you put this up to your ear and shake it, you can actually hear the powder moving around. So I assume that they probably fill these to volume rather than to mass, because these do vary a little bit in weight. But as for the spring itself, I have noticed this. So again, this is also compatible between an AR-15 and a 416. However, this is a much heavier spring than normal. I did try to run this in my AR-15, and I could not get enough gas through the system to get it to cycle properly, just because I'm using a kind of, I think the gas system on my particular AR up here is a little bit messed up, but you could run it, and yeah, if it works, then no problem. One thing on this, do see the way you can identify the HK buffer spring is they have a red line. The new ones have a red line going across on both sides here. You can see there. However, the older generation ones actually have the front just kind of spray painted. It almost looks like in the same sort of HK red. So both of these are legit. They're both the same weight, and both are totally compatible between the two. Just a little bit of a visual difference there. Next, moving forward to the pins, the takedown pin and the pivot pin. I'll just go ahead and talk about both of them right now. Those are also the same on the 416, and compared to the AR-15, all the same. The MR556, they use locking pins, which I have one on here. The way that works is they just have an extra little detent in it just to keep things rigid, and they do work actually quite well. I have another one on here because it has some pretty bad play between my upper and lower, but they're a little bit annoying to take down, and I wouldn't recommend them in any other case unless just kind of like the rattling is annoying you, then go ahead and do it. But As far as the pin diameter and all of the dimensions go, they're identical, so those can be interchanged completely. The fire control group, I'll go ahead and talk about that one next. So this is an interesting one where the parts are totally compatible. It's just that the HK safety axle in specific is kind of particularly hard to install because they use roll pins to put these levers on, which is nice, again, for not having to worry about a set screw, for example, or just those little tiny screws that usually go on ambi safeties. Those can't back out because you just have it literally roll pinned in. I do like these safeties quite a lot. You can see I actually have these on actually my AR as well as on this clone, just because they are nice. I do like them quite a bit, just being pinned in, and I don't need to worry about anything. If you do install these and you happen to need to take them off, however, I would caution you to be very careful when you're punching these out. A 1/16 inch punch, and I don't know, I've tried several 1/16 inch roll pin punches, and they've all had this issue. So maybe I've just had really bad luck, but I've noticed that this hole right here on the safety, where it goes through the lever itself, is slightly larger, so you'll be able to put that punch through just fine. But when you actually start getting to the axle part itself, it's a smaller diameter there, so much so that the punch can get stuck. And I got it really badly stuck when I was installing some new selector levers on my MR762. So you can get it out. The way I did it is I actually put the stuck punch into a vise and then just kind of wiggled it out of place. And it wasn't pleasant, but it did work and it did get it out. Compatibility, though, they're identical. However, just having this safety, I did see some people on some forums confused about this. This safety itself will not allow you. So one of the features of the 416 is that you can drop the hammer and then put it back on safe, and it won't cause any issue. Just as you can see right there, it's all good. But just having this safety doesn't do anything. That's not what impacts the safety. That's or rather, that doesn't impact whether you can put it on safe when the hammer's dropped or not. That's just it's just a lever. Everything regarding whether you can drop it on safe or not with the hammer is all with the trigger itself. So to talk about the trigger itself, I don't have one of the actual 416 triggers. I use a lot of Schmeisser triggers because they're nice triggers, and they allow me to do that same sort of functionality, which I do like. But the 416 triggers, or I should say the MR556 triggers, and we're not talking about the select fire here, those civilian MR triggers are in fact apparently compatible with an AR. I don't know why you would bother going with one. They're more complex than a regular AR trigger, and if you are interested in one for that ability to drop the hammer while it's unsafe and to put it back and all that, there's much cheaper options that are a lot simpler to install, like the Schmeisser that I just mentioned. KE Armed makes one, and there's actually a lot more as well. Next, the grips. These are also all compatible, no issues whatsoever there. One other thing on these pins, the trigger and the hammer pins, these are compatible, however, on the newest 416 A5, and I'm not sure if the newest civilian MR223 has this in Europe, because we only have MR556s here, unfortunately, in America, but those apparently use C-clips on the pins. Now for a more nuanced part that is technically compatible, but does require modification, the A5 trigger guards. I have one here, which was originally black. I just got it cere-coated with the rest of this rifle here. This standard AR-15 lower just has a lot of A5 parts on it, just because I was curious how they would work. That's why I'm now doing the video. So the standard AR trigger guard, of course, the front pin is it's a detent. You can push it in and pull this down for the because the old ones were just flat, and you could use it as, you know, open it up for winter, so you could fit gloves in. But this newer trigger guard from HK, they actually use a dual roll pin system. Now, on your regular AR lower, of course, on the left side, you don't have a hole in the front of the trigger guard. So I did actually have to drill one out. Unfortunately, when I did, I used a really bad drill bit that broke, and then it kind of wasn't a perfect circle. But you do need to have some way. So there's actually two ways, I should say. You either need to drill this, like I did here, so you can punch it in and punch it out if need be, or you need to take a trigger guard roll pin and shorten it, or find a shorter one. Because all you really need to do is to get the roll pin started here, and then just have it going in partially on that trigger guard, and it'll hold it perfectly. House Manufacturing actually does sell one. They sell a set, I should say, that's just a regular roll pin back here, and then a shortened one here. That way, if you do need to remove this and you're using it on a standard AR lower, you can just push it in all the way into this trigger guard and then pull this out like normal. Otherwise, you're gonna not be able to put this front roll pin in as much as it should be. Or you also just run the risk of it getting stuck in there, which would really, really suck. So do note that before you try to install one of these A5 trigger guards, that they do a weird thing right up here on this front roll pin. Moving slightly up here, the magazine release is all identical, so no issues there, nothing to worry about. The A5s are an ambi one, but it's all compatible. Next is the A5 bolt catch, which I have right here. These are quite nice, but if you're familiar with the PDQ, I thought that it would be a pretty similar installation with those. They're just an ambi bolt catch. You just need to drill your bolt catch channel out, just make it right across, and then you can just pop it right in. This A5 is actually significantly more hands-on and a lot more complicated than that. With this one, you actually need to... I have this installed, so you won't be able to see it too well, but it's a pretty straightforward process, but if you're doing it by hand, it does actually take a lot of just kind of fine measuring, so you're not overdoing it and over-drilling. But first off, you do need to make that same sort of cut as if this is a PDQ, to just let this lever on the right side go all the way through. But second, internally, this A5 bolt catch actually drops down ever so slightly right about here, where the actual internal bolt catch kind of sits up on the mag. Underneath here, it does sit a bit down, so you need to, when you're cutting this, you need to drill the, or however you're doing it, Dremel, whatever, you do need to make some clearance, a little step going down. And then, for me, I also had to really get this quite flat, so this lever wouldn't be grinding up against the side of the lower. Again, this is compatible, but this one did require a significant, unsurprisingly, because it's an ambi bolt catch, it did require a significant amount of work to get it to install, but they are quite nice. Now, I am focusing mostly on the A5 sort of parts, but I did want to talk about the magazines really quick. Back on the original 416, they were having an issue where all mil-spec magazines were supposed to work, but then they discovered that PMags would not. On the newest MR556s and the military select fire variants, PMags will work completely fine. You don't need to worry about that. If you do go with MR556 lower or what have you, no issues with mags. Truly, all mil-spec mags will work now. That about covers it for the lower. I'm going to go ahead and get the upper out now. There's not a huge amount to talk about on that, but there is still a few things that are compatible between the two. So here's just an MR556 lower, which is a pretty good representation of a 416, just not select fire. So there's a fair amount of parts on here that are compatible, just not kind of the important ones are not. Starting with the charging handle. The charging handle is completely compatible. I have just one of the Geissele government charging handles on here, which I do quite like, and they work. They have no issues whatsoever. Vice versa, you could take one of the 416 charging handles and pop it into an AR-15, and they would work no problem. The bolt carrier group, pretty much everything on here is proprietary, with the exception of the cam pin. You can use a AR-15 cam pin. In my case, I'm using a Lantac, as you can see, kind of that brass color there, because these are a bit rounded, and especially on this piston upper, it does help to kind of reduce the wear on the inside of that groove, just right about here. I have already noticed, even though I don't have a huge round count, that I'm seeing a little bit of wear on that area, so if you're going to go with one of these uppers, or probably any of the piston uppers, I would recommend to switch to one of these, or to the POF. They have a full-on rounded one, which I don't own one, but they do seem pretty good, so I might look into one in the future. Forward assist, also completely compatible with AR-15 ones. I'm using a Strike Industries light, ultra light I believe they call it, one, just because they're lighter, as the name implies. It's not a part I use too often, so they do have reduced material. It's not the most comfortable to be like slamming on it constantly, but just a little bit extra, just cutting a tiny bit of weight. The ejection port cover, or the dust port, or the dust cover, this is compatible between the AR-15 and the 416, both vice versa. We'll go either way. This does install differently. So if you look right here, you have your regular axle pin right here that the dust cover itself sits on. But instead of a C-clip like you have on your mil-spec AR-15 uppers, you have actually a roll pin. So on the inside of this ejection port axle, there's a little groove here, and I believe there was a second groove in here somewhere for just kind of lining stuff up. But you need to line up this groove on the axle with a roll pin. It's HK, so of course there's roll pins everywhere. And you just punch this tiny, tiny roll pin in. When I first did this, it sounded really difficult because this is such a tiny roll pin and all that, but it's actually really, really straightforward, and actually, after doing that, I kind of really like this installation. They're really solid. They don't come off, but they're also not such a pain to deal with as those C-clips. Now onto the barrel and all the parts on here. So, the barrel itself, or I should say the barrel extension in here, is completely different. You unfortunately cannot use AR-15 or 416 barrels, vice versa. You can't do that at all. You have to have a 416 barrel and a 416. Actually, the A5 as well also has a different extension to complicate things a little further. They beefed up the pin inside of here. It's already larger, and on the A5 they went even larger and even beefier. Of course, the gas system is piston on here, so you can't use anything from an AR, and specifically it's a proprietary HK gas piston, so you can't put on any of those other aftermarket ones. Barrel nut is also proprietary, and the gas block itself also proprietary. One other thing I wanted to note on this is the A5, the 416 A5, yet again, has another difference here. So the older 416s and the MR556s, as is on the civilian market, these use a 2-pin system, but on the newest A5s, a single-pin system that is also goes onto the barrel a bit differently and is just a way tighter fit. Apparently they only went with 1 pin instead for harmonics, which makes sense, but also if you're doing an A5 build, it's probably better to just try to get one that actually has a gas block compatibility with the old gas blocks, because finding those A5 gas blocks is pretty much impossible from what I've noticed. Last though, going to the muzzle device. Well, thankfully we're kind of ending this saga of just like proprietary, and thankfully the muzzle device is regular. This is a 1.5 by 28. The European model might be using the 15 by 1 metric thread, but US model, everything's the 1.5 by 28, just totally standard AR-15 threads, so you don't need to worry about that, and yeah, these will work perfectly fine. So that about covers it. There's probably a little bit of nuance that I may have missed, so if you have any other questions on any of this sort of stuff, then do let me know in the comments. I have been trying to research this for this build for quite a bit now, so I think I have a pretty good idea of which parts are compatible and not. So let me know on that if you do have any other questions. Otherwise, thank you all for watching, especially if you got this far. And hopefully, if nothing else, you found this interesting, as I do. I go autistic over all these parts because I find them really fascinating. But at any rate, hope to see you all in the next one. Take care. I'll see you all then.